Eric Doak here for our last chapter of Medical Ethics, Spring 2020. We're going to be looking at the history of medical experimentation in America. And normally in class, I would have us talk about what we think the purposes of experimentation are, the benefits, the dangers. Um, and I'd urge you to go to the Wikipedia site, Unethical Human Experimentation in the United States. If I do not sufficiently scare you enough in this presentation, I'd urge you to go see the other experiments that are much less well known than, say, the Tuskegee experiment, uh, and have a look, because a lot of covering this stuff makes it seem like these were the bad old days, but unfortunately, medical experimentation is alive and well. Um, and hopefully I show you enough to prove the point. But I'm going to begin by reading from our textbook, page 702, and we'll rock and roll. So, at the end of World War II, the most gruesomely spectacular examples of unethical research were showcased at the trials of Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. During the war, physicians sympathetic to Nazi ideology conducted or experimented on a range of medical experiments in which victims of the Nazi concentration camps were subjected to cruel, humiliating, and often lethal procedures in the name of medical research. At the Buchenwald camp, for example, homosexual men, Jews, gypsies, and other prisoners were divided into study groups. Subjects in the experimental arm were given an experimental vaccine against typhus, and members of the control group were infected with typhus-infected blood. Nearly all of the unimmunized controls, many who received the experimental vaccines, died as a result of the infections they contracted. Sorry, guys, I'm just my first cup of coffee. Just getting going. My words will catch up to me, I assume. At Ravensbrück, bones, oh my lord, were transplanted from one prisoner to another in order to study the regeneration of nerves, muscle, and bone. In other experiments, prisoners in camps were shot in order to study the ballistics of bullets, starved in order to observe the physiology of malnutrition, or infected with gangrene so that the efficacy of different treatments could be studied. In order to study the length of time that a downed pilot could survive in freezing water, Jewish and Russian prisoners were submerged in tubs of freezing water until they froze to death. Others were removed at various points, and different methods for reviving them were tested, including the use of naked Jewish women, who were forced to revive the near-frozen subject with the warmth of their bare flesh. In order to study the effect of high altitude on pilots, camp prisoners were put in pressure chambers that subjected them to lethal extremes in atmospheric pressure. All the while, researchers observed through a window, documenting the readout of their instruments and the state of the agonized subject. At the end of the war, 23 Nazi physicians and bureaucrats were placed on trial, and 16 were subsequently convicted of war crimes. Of these, 7 were sentenced to death. So, in the end, 7 Nazi physicians were sentenced to death. In an effort to support and explicate the tribunal's judgment that the Nazi medical experiments were monstrosities masquerading as medical science, the judge enunciated a set of principles that would make explicit the ethical requirements for accepting human subjects research. The product, in fact, is the Nuremberg Code in the opening passages below, and this is like where we get the most unambiguous, clear-cut definition and ensconcing of the idea of informed consent. They say the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him or her to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So, what do we got here? We have the Nazis, classic bad guy of the 20th century, being judged for doing these horrible experiments, trying to take over the world, create a huge, genocide. And this is like, oh, this is my bread and butter. Because like the thing a lot of people don't realize, the Germans were like the smartest, most advanced, most prosperous industrial country in the world, pretty much. They had they were leaders in philosophy, in science, in creativity, in even education. Much of our like public education system is directly based on the Prussian model. It's really like a training. It goes back to the Battle of Jena, 1804. Yeah, Jena, Jena. Someone fact check me. And they're like, yeah, we don't really want free thinking people. We want good, obedient workers. But it's worth noting that like these people were the smartest people in the world, and they were also nurses and doctors who experimented on people, tortured them against their will. Like, were they horrible people? Were they fulfilling their oath as a healthcare worker? Were they not? I don't know. And the thing that also isn't as well known is that at the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis defended their practices based on what the Americans were doing. We had open American eugenics societies over here. We like Henry Ford and others were like devout supporters of Hitler, like openly racist. And so they're like, hey, we were like literally, you guys were doing the Tuskegee experiment. Like we're basing our practices off you. And so it's kind of like it made the US not look as good. We're like all dressed out holier than thou and white, garbs and halos. And they're like, hey, you guys are we're basing what we did on what you did. And we're like, all right, your time's done here. Off to death. And so, having looked at the Nazis, we will look at Americans. And many of you have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study. It's probably the most well-known unethical experiment that's gotten public attention in the U.S., although there have been many others. I don't know if any have gone on as long as the Tuskegee went on. Reading from 704 here. No other research scandal has done more to undermine public trust in the research enterprise and to galvanize support for the regulation and oversight of research of human subjects than was perhaps the most profound case of unethical research in U.S. history. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment involved the systematic deception and abuse of poor African American men from 1932 to 1972. Undertaken in part to determine the effects of untreated syphilis in this population, the study recruited its 400 subjects by lying to them outright about providing treatment for bad blood. The entire study was predicated on deception. Subjects were never informed of their true medical condition and were not told that they were participants in a research study designed to observe the lethal effects of untreated syphilis. So they're being employed in a non-therapeutic experiment. The big definition I want us to get out of today is therapeutic and non-therapeutic. Therapeutic, the purpose of the experiment is for the direct therapeutic benefit of the patient. And non-therapeutic treatments is for the patient's involved in research that's not directly leading to the patient's health, right? They might be tracking something else. In this case, they wanted to see whether syphilis spread at the same rate and with the same severity through black populations as white populations. That was like the explicit, goal of the experiment. In addition to this flagrant disregard for the principles of veracity and informed consent, the researchers, drawn largely from the U.S. Public Health Service, you will hear that name more by the end of today, also actively prevented participants from receiving effective medical care as it became available, including penicillin when it became widely available at the end of World War II. There is no doubt that this failure to treat led to the premature death of many subjects, their spouses, and sexual partners. So what happened was, let's see if I can pull up it. So real brief timeline. We have one of these in our book as well on page 725. But started in 1932. They got 399 men with syphilis and 201 without, so about 600 people. They didn't tell them they were treating them for syphilis or that the study was about syphilis. It was literally bad blood, right? Which is like, they don't know. But again, these are very uneducated people living in a very poor county right after the Depression. So, like, It's rough. And so they treat them. Nurse Rivers is one of the nurses who's there from the inception to the end. And it's worth thinking about what life would be like as a nurse in that situation if you are an African American nurse who is deceptively treating African Americans for 40 years. And it gets worse and worse because not only does penicillin come out as an effective treatment, uh, but the U.S. Public Health Service, who's running this experiment, prevents all of the counties around from giving penicillin to the participants in the experiment, and literally banned them from going into service because men who went into service also got penicillin. And so, literally, an effective, safe treatment for syphilis, which is super debilitating. It's got 3 stages. It goes into your spine, causes all sorts of pain and neurological breakdown. Uh, Very sad stuff. And then it transferred to the wives, to the next of kin, because it's just running through like the families, because not everyone's got it, but by the end, most people have it. So I'll let you look through it. Every year, the U.S. Public Health Service kept issuing money to it. I mean, the Nuremberg trials are in here somewhere, right? And meanwhile, it doesn't end until one news reporter gets coverage of it and runs with it. And just like that, after 40 years, it closes up, and suddenly Congress is like, someone needs to be held responsible. Yada, yada, yada. Some actual pictures from the study. Oh, my Lord. The test was terminated in 1972. Many men had died, 40 wives had contracted the disease, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. No big deal. And then, of course, what you will find, and I'll show you again elsewhere, is that we always wait decades before we formally apologize. We're like, yeah, sorry, we just lied to you guys for 40 years and just wrecked your families. But from 1972 until 1997, we waited. And then Bill Clinton's like, we formally apologize. So this was the guy who founded the U.S. Public Health Service and then quit the year after the experiment started. Which, as far as I know, is the only legit person who ever worked in the U.S. Public Health Office, at least in this line of things we're doing. Here you see the actual picture that said "Colored people, bad blood, free blood test, free treatment" campaign flyer, 1930s. So if you just see that free treatment, right? This is one of the doctors. The stores putting signs up for penicillin, even though they were not allowed to treat people participating in the study. One of the spinal taps, they were literally spinal tapping people, not telling them what they were doing to get fluid for testing. Man being tested for syphilis, 1935, more blood drawn. An unidentified woman is tested for syphilis. Women are tested in order to allay fears that the Tuskegee study was merely a ploy to lure black men into the armed services. So remember, they're very suspicious. Blood being drawn. Here's a sample of the men. Just men doing their best, not knowing what's going on, not being informed. 1932, 1972. Here we see Nurse Rivers. And she was the go-to point. Because a lot of you think about it, they had to go into these small communities in Macon County and talk men into participating in the study. And if you're this slick white lab coat wearing white doctor, you're not going to be able to speak the language of these people. And so Nurse Rivers was literally the person with the street talk, who had the swag and also had the medical training, and so she could help doctors out and be the person who would explain the doctor's talk to the patients, et cetera, et cetera. She did this for 40 years. Is this a good person? Is this a bad person? The men loved her. There she is. There she is. But what are they doing to these people? Receiving special free treatment. They don't know what they're getting. They're getting some pain pills, which they thought was the creme de la creme. That is not from the Tuskegee experiment. And so you might be ready to hold the Tuskegee trials and take all of these people and put them on the death, the death panel, death chamber, whatever I'm trying to say, right up alongside the Nazi doctors. And I used to kind of have that sentiment, but as you know, I like to test our moral intuitions. And so I'd urge you to watch this whole movie called Mrs. Evers' Boys. And it's based around the Nurse Rivers, who was there from the beginning to the end and gives you a firsthand view of who she was, why she did what she did, and the motivations around it and other factors that kind of give a little bit more context and, dare I say, nuance to the situation. But I'm going to play the beginning and the end, and then we'll do a brief recap and wrap this up. So,
I solemnly pledge myself before God to pass my life in purity, to practice my profession faithfully, to endeavor with loyalty, to assist the physician in his work, to devote myself to the welfare of those patients committed to my care. That's the oath I took, Senator. Just like the doctors do, I took an oath, the nurse's oath. You have to understand, nursing was my life.
We do understand and respect that, Miss Evers. And we do appreciate very much your testifying before us today. I hope you understand that the sole purpose of this committee is to discover the truth about the public health service program commonly called the Tuskegee Study.
That's what we all want, sir.
Good. Now, I understand you worked on the program from the beginning.
From the very first in 1932 up until I retired a few years ago. Nearly 40 years.
Oh, goodness. That's longer than I've been in the Senate. Tell me, Miss Evans, how did you feel about the study?
Our patients got the best doctrine they ever had in their life.
But according to the testimony so far, Miss Evers, there are ways in which this study sounds like some sort of Nazi experiment. It was established at Nuremberg that experimentation without informed...
You could, whatever. There was an epidemic with all that syphilis going around, Senator. Life was always hard in Macon County, but the Depression made it worse. You just have no idea what it was like down there back then.
We've heard a lot of testimonies, Miss Evers, from some of the patients, from other nurses, and from your supervisor, Dr. Brodus.
Dr. Brodus is a fine doctor who cared, Senator. I don't care what y'all say about him now. I was honored to serve under that man.
and then cutting to the end.
Cannot. You always tell me to do what's right, don't you? Well, what I'm doing is right. It's gotta be right, Papa. It was right. It had to be right. Men kept dying. But they would have died anyway, wouldn't they? I prepared a report every spring on the number of them remaining. 412 in 1946, 360 10 years later. And then last year when the papers got a hold to the story, it was 127 left. Of the 412 that we started with, 127 were left. And of Miss Evers' boys, it was just two. It's Willie and Caleb. I had heard that he got the job up north. He never married. So that brings us to Washington, D.C. I guess none of us ended up where we thought we would.
I simply don't understand, Miss Evers. Much as we may appreciate your personal sacrifice, the fact remains that patients with a potentially fatal disease went untreated when treatment was available.
It was for the greater good.
Who's good, Miss Evers? Who has benefited?
We proved that there's no difference between how blacks and whites respond to syphilis. The benefit of that...
If they were white, Miss Evers, if they were white, would these men have been treated as they were? You should know better than anyone.
Yes, I do, Senator. If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared. If they had been white, you congressmen wouldn't have voted every year for 40 years. If they had been white, somebody would have said something before now because everybody knew what was going on. It wasn't no secret. But because they were black, nobody cared. Because they were black, the U.S. government, thought that they were expendable. Now you're trying to push the blame off on me and the fine doctors who did the best we could with the choice you gave us to make. Whether to leave those men in neglect or to give him the best care that was within our power to give. Nursing them men was my life, mister.
We're not trying to blame you, Miss Evers. We understand you were acting under orders. Orders from Dr. Brodus and the others.
I went up that hill on my own. I can carry the weight of the burden by myself.
But, Miss Evers, what in the world did you think you were doing?
Honoring my oath as a nurse, Senator. I love those men. They were susceptible to kindness, and I gave them all that I had. You sure could dance. Feet went faster than the music. Go home, come on. This is over.
Of course they did. How about that? So, man, do I love that last scene. Nurse Rivers drops the hammer. She doesn't push she's no like Adam in the Garden of Adam and Eve. Eve made me do it. I'm not responsible. She's like, I walked up that hill on my own. I can carry the burden on my own. But what does she make the case for? One, that she was honoring her duty as a nurse, and two, that they were giving those men the best doctoring available at the time. Because what you don't know is that there was no money for any medical care at all, right? No facilities down there, Macon County, 1932. But the U.S. Public Health Office was like, we will give you money and resources to do this experiment, and you'll be able to give them pain pills, you'll be able to do basic checkups and check-ins. So you're actually providing better nursing care than they would get without it, even though they're being involved in a non-therapeutic experiment that they don't know what's going on, right? So she's like, actually, no, we were giving them better care than they would have gotten. She was honoring her duty as a nurse, being like, my duty is to provide the best care for my patients in the situation that they're in. Yeah. And she even threatened to leave several times when funding got cut and it wasn't going to get finished. I'd urge you to watch the movie. It's incredibly good. It will definitely test your moral intuitions going into it. And I will see you again on the other side.